All right. I had to put my glasses on so I can see. I got so much brightness going on here. We are going to talk to Neil Gyte. He just did this crazy goal of swimming, I think it was 20 miles in a cold water river, and did it fasted to share our body's ability to use fat as fuel. Now, I will do some other podcasts, got a few ready to go this week on, do we need carbohydrates? How much do we need? And how much glucose do you need in your blood to survive? And it's just a tiny little bit. So I am diving into women versus men. Do we need to fuel for workouts? How do we tap in to that fuel that, say, we have 40,000 calories of stored fat in our body, 2,000 calories of stored glycogen in our muscles and liver to be used as fuel? But what if there's alternative fuel source, as taking ketone IQ, taking a shot, which I was just going to do before I recorded because I haven't had time to eat, but some coffee. I've got some butter in my coffee today and some heavy cream. I've got my water with my creatine and BioSil collagen projector, collagen production ingredients. The ketone shots are something to do for brain fuel, alternative fuel source, and to spare glycogen. So I was asking Neil if he used any of these in his swim race. We'll hear about that, and as well as essential amino acids. So taking ketones, exogenous ketones, as ketone IQ, you'll hear about a lot of the cyclists in Tour de France, professional cyclists doing the long distance. They'll take these shots and now they have gel packs during an event. I think it's great for taking ketone shots when you're doing long endurance, adventure racing, where you need a little more brain focus, is cycling, and really making sure we have alternative fuel source for the brain. So here's Neil. Let me bring him on the show and we'll talk about his race. All right, gang, I've got Neil on the show. I feel weird saying Neil because my husband's named Neil, but you're not my husband. It's another Neil.
Indeed not.
You are recovered from a big epic swim and awareness of metabolic health, and we wanted to come back on the show to talk post race, and now we're after the race. So thanks for carving out time in your day to talk about how it all went and share with everyone all the data we'll dive into.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Debbie. It's one of the things we agreed when I came on last time was, yeah, we've got to do a post challenge race summary of how it all went. So excited to, yeah, share with you and the listeners how the 22-mile 0-calorie swim went.
All right, so I'm just going to start showing everybody what you did, the beginning of it. So I'm going to pull up, if you guys are watching the YouTube video, we'll go to your Neil Gyte website. Is this the one here, the start two, or is that, which one's best
Yeah,
to
the start
show?
two is perfect. Yeah, there's one and two, but that's a nice
Okay, this is
landscape
just a few
landscape
seconds,
view.
but this is pretty epic. Look at that start.
Yeah.
So talk us a little bit of what you did, and this is just a few seconds. So talk to us where you swam and share the event again.
Yeah, of course. So the weather gods, as you can see, were incredibly kind to us. Mentally going into this, I was prepared for, storms, torrential rain, kind of waves like you'd see in the sea, because I think you have to be, prepared for the worst. And thankfully, an area of high pressure came over Scotland. So we just had beautiful, flat glass like waters, which was great. So we 22 miles swim. We started at the southern tip of Loch Lomond. The wind was kind of, I would say, east to southeast, so it didn't matter too much which way we
Okay.
did it, but we decided to swim south up to north. And so yeah, so that footage was yeah, if you hit replay again, yeah, that was about 20 minutes into the start. We started about 6:30 a.m. in the morning, so we were up pretty much just before 4 to obviously get prepped and drive down to the start. And yeah, the first few hours, of course, with the beautiful sunrise. and just feeling good in the very cold, fresh water. So it was about 12 degrees, 54 Fahrenheit. Of course, we were
Oh,
wearing wetsuits and yeah, gloves and boots and hats to make sure we didn't succumb to the cold. We actually went in the day prior, a couple of days prior, actually, just in skins to get acclimatized to the to the temperature. So definitely would have been a different swim without wetsuit. But yeah, it was just an amazing weather, amazing start to the day. And so I think yeah, this is and towards the end. So as you can see, we're maybe a little bit less fluid towards the end, both of us, as after
yeah.
12 hours swimming. So it took us, yeah, so it took us just under 12 hours, I think 11 hours, 55 minutes for the 22 miles, 36 kilometers. We stopped pretty much after an hour. So we would do an hour, we would stop. I would take on just water and electrolytes. We'd stop maybe for 2, 3, 4 minutes, depending, and then we would go again for another 60 minutes, and then we would stop to make sure to continually be hydrated. And we just effectively kept that going. So and as always, there weren't too many I would say like major like hiccups, issues, and challenges. There was one fun one I had in the first 2, 3 hours, which I'll I'll happily talk to. And then, but like any
Oh,
endurance
shoot,
event, I
goodness.
think once you get to halfway, then you start to yeah feel good that you're halfway done. But I mean, I've never swum 12 hours before, so that was definitely a different one. But it was just yeah, it was a we had a beautiful day, and it was a really mostly enjoyable swim.
Hmm. So, how did you train if this is your first time going 12 hours swimming without, how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, so I took a similar approach as I have done to previous Ironman and other endurance events, which is I think if you get up to kind of
Whoops,
80%
hold
of
on. I
the
gotta
of the
stop. The videos keep playing. I gotta get out. Okay. Sorry.
no, it's yeah, no problems. So for me, I think it was, building up to it and at least doing one training swim about 80% of the distance and time, then I think
Hmm.
gives you enough that on challenge day, hopefully well rested, which ironically I wasn't particularly well rested, but that's another part of doing endurance events. So I did longer swims. I think I did, 20K, 25K. The max I did was a 30K pool swim. So that took me about 9.5 hours.
Wait,
So
you
literally,
swam in a pool for 9.5 hours?
yeah.
How in
So
the
I live in
world did you do
Houston.
that?
Well, I live in Houston, so there's so training for the environment was really tricky because there's just no real open water swimming here. So pretty much all my training was, yeah, was in the pool. And so I just remember what my old or my kind of coach, who still coaches me a little bit more informally now, Luke, used to say that it's all good mental training. So I remember for Ironmans, he used to, he used to make me do, loops of like 3, 4K to go back the house to simulate. Sometimes in Ironmans, you have looped courses where you have to run past the finish line, 3, 4 times, and that mental kind of training to do that. So I think it was similar in the pool. It's much more enjoyable swimming outdoors, and the pool, yeah, you just have to kind of go in there and get it done. So I think it was good mental
That's funny.
training that made the challenge day more enjoyable. Like the first trial swim we did, so I flew over about a week ahead of it. We went and did a couple of days to test out the gear. And that first day, just swam for 2 hours, feeling fresh in the cold water, not having to do a flip turn. It was just, it was just amazing because I was like, this challenge day is going to be so much more enjoyable than my training days
Oh,
just flipping laps in a pool.
that's funny. Okay, so you're training for this event, but you're training, so you need the distance to get used to going that long. But how did you train to do it fasted? What are some things that prepared you to be more metabolically healthy and metabolically efficient to tap into fat for your main fuel source?
Yeah, so the main thing really was diet and nutrition. So very much on a, ketogenic, low carb diet. I would cycle in carbs tactically to try and not be too strict or stringent, but much of it was that as a baseline. So if your body has very little carbohydrates in it, any training exercise you're doing, then you are predominantly utilizing fat as fuel. And then whether that fat comes from your own body fat or comes from, dietary fat, I don't think makes a huge difference. I actually didn't do a huge amount of, I would say, extended fasted training, a lot less than people maybe would think. And that's because I was trying to rebalance. I did have very low testosterone back kind of 6 months ago. So trying to build that up whilst training for something like this was a really delicate balance. And so I
Hmm.
would do shorter sessions. I would always do fasted. So when I'm doing anything less than 2 hours, I would always do those relatively early in the morning and fasted because that doesn't put too much tax on the body. And then the longer I get, I would just mix in. I would say maybe 75% of them, I would just go on feel. So I would swim fasted until I really felt my body saying, look, I need some food or something kind of, inside. And then I would just eat small amounts of macadamia nuts or keto bricks were a great training fuel partner. Just kind of, yeah, easy, accessible, that is, high in high quality, healthy fats, but very low in carbohydrates. But the 9 hour training, 30K swim, I actually did that totally fasted. I wasn't necessarily planning to because I figured on challenge day, a lot of it is the mental approach. But I was just feeling so good throughout that 30K swim that I just kind of kept going and kept going and kept going. And I think once the body gets into that state of metabolism where it really is utilizing fat as the only fuel, and you are producing glucose but just enough that your organs need. I actually just felt like I was in a great state of homeostasis, and so then the body just, it's like you're an electric car that has no range anxiety. You don't need to, obviously, to stop and kind of recharge. You just feel like you can keep on going. So getting into that state is has helped significantly, and you actually end up not feeling particularly hungry as long as your hormones are in balance. That's one thing that I would say is I did notice the times during training when my hormones weren't particularly in balance. You feel the hunger, I would say, more significantly. When you're in that kind of homeostasis and everything things feels a little bit more balanced, then the body is in that kind of safe, adaptive stress zone where it's just happy to keep going and keep going.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I was trying to look at this up the other day, but how much glucose do you need on hand for survival is just 1 teaspoon. And I was just pulling this up. A carbohydrate source is equal to 4 to 5 grams of glucose if you do get low, but you're doing gluconeogenesis, so your body's breaking down protein, you find, to create that baseline glucose that your body needs.
Yeah, so I mean, it can produce it from both fat and protein. So I don't think, I know there's a lot of literature out there that suggests that the body will break down, muscle.
Yeah.
From all the research that I've done, I think it depends on what metabolic state your body in and how fat adapted
Mm.
you are. And I personally believe, and the one downside, I would love to have done a DEXA scan before and after to show muscle mass or muscle composition, because I honestly feel like my, I didn't tap into any of my muscles throughout the swim. I just felt that it was all fat generated. Now, obviously, I can't prove that, but I just have to say, yeah, I mean, it would be pretty difficult because your body, that's the other thing about doing endurance, is your body needs the muscles to power you through. And so from that perspective, your body has, as long as it's got surplus fat, I think if you're running a very low body fat percentage, then maybe the body does say survival is the most important thing. So I think it just looks at the tank of how much fat do I have stored, and I will use that. If that gets down to a critical level, then I will switch to muscle. Or if my body is not adapted to using fat, then I think it's more likely to burn muscle. But personally, yeah, I just felt that it was all generated from my fat stores.
Well, that's what you hear about our body's innate intelligence, how brilliant our body is, and how it finds a way to keep going and survive. So it will create that glucose that it needs to keep in the blood
Yeah,
however
and
it
that was one of
can.
the amazing things actually looking at so I wore Levels provided me with a continuous glucose monitor specifically to look at what happens to your glucose, what's happening from a metabolism perspective. And so that I found fascinating because And whilst I actually initially thought it would be pretty boring and that it would start
Here, I
off
can
somewhere high, you would
pull
get
that
a
up.
spike
Gotcha.
afterwards. Yeah, so this is it. So it's kind of the trend is what I would expected. So you can see sunrise towards the left, and then you can see the swim start. So always, whenever I've done any exercise, I always get a spike, and I think that is the body. It prefers to use glucose. I think just because too much glucose in the bloodstream, as you mentioned, is toxic. So I think the body always will try and use glucose first. If it doesn't have any glucose, then it downregulates that and it really switches to fat burning and ketones. So I get a very small spike and then it slowly drops down, drops down, drops down, which is what I was expecting. The fascinating thing for me is the dips that you see, almost regularly on every single hour. So that's when we were stopped taking on water and electrolytes. And I think for me, especially the second
Mhm.
half is super fascinating because you're there getting down to very low levels of glucose. So this is your body just creating the amount of glucose that it needs. So when I'm swimming, my level was pretty much bang on consistent at 55 milligrams per deciliter of glucose, and it
Mhm.
stayed very stable during that. But when I stopped, it would actually drop down to 40 or sometimes just below 40. And the levels device actually doesn't read. I don't think it dropped dramatically below 40, but there was a couple where you get a less than 40. And that I just found fascinating because it just shows our bodies are so sensitive to glucose that I think that the body will just down regulate glucose to only what the organs truly need to keep going, and then obviously upregulated. So maybe the organs need a little bit more glucose as you're doing exercise, but all of that not is just created by the body. Your body will convert fat into fat or other substrates into glucose to create the small amount of glucose you need. But this for me demonstrates one of the things about the swim, which is, we don't need to fuel with carbohydrates and sugar for athletic endeavor. The body will happily run on fat as a fuel source. Now, obviously, there can be some benefits to adding, carbohydrates in, but I think a lot of the narrative out there that, you need to be consuming 100, 120 grams of sugar and carbohydrates an hour is driving a lot of the metabolic dysfunction. And this really was to try and help people understand that we don't need it. And so think about how to utilize the two main fuel sources that your body uses. And your body will happily swim for 12 hours, 22 miles, 36 kilometers without consuming any calories as long as you train for it and you've got adequate fat stores, which I think, 99% of the population would have.
Would you have to well, definitely improve your fat metabolism and being metabolically flexible before you do event as this, as you did. And then do you have, when you stopped, did you have any signs of hypoglycemia since it is lower? Did you feel dizzy? Any of those common symptoms?
No, no,
No.
not at all. And that's one of I think if you are fat adapted, then you just honestly, I just, well, I felt largely great, throughout, even at the end. Obviously once you finish, you have the elation of finishing, but um, my arms and shoulders obviously were pretty tired after swimming for 12 hours. But other than that, I felt like I could have gone and, run a marathon. My legs still felt pretty fresh. And when you're in that metabolic state, your body just has this continual source of energy. So certainly wasn't, tired afterwards. We went back and had a nice, family dinner. My mum and dad came up for the swim. My older brother was in the support boat with us. And so yeah, and then even the following day, yes, arms and shoulders were tired, but I really, honestly, during the breaks, you just felt great. And so I think it's just back to the body's innate intelligence that it will keep things running. And I personally, and this is obviously just my personal perspective, believe that in that state, those levels of glucose are more than adequate for, or let's say they are adequate for what the body needs. But I found it fascinating that the body still down regulates glucose when the organs don't need it, even when you're at very low levels. And that I find really fascinating and interesting because
Mhm.
it shows that you just shows how sensitive we are to glucose and blood sugar. And hence the other way, when you start adding too much in, it's why it causes so much metabolic dysfunction because our bodies just aren't designed for, as you mentioned earlier, we can tolerate 1 teaspoon of sugar in our 6 liters of blood. Any more than that is toxic to our bodies, and therefore you have to get it out of the blood into the muscles or into the just out of the blood to put it somewhere else in the body.
Yeah, before I close this, when you're these lower ranges and then these dips, it'd be cool to, they don't have a continuous ketone monitor, but it'd be fascinating to see what level your ketones were if you did it, tested your ketones every time you're here. That is increased when your glucose is so low.
Yeah, so I did try. Unfortunately, the continuous ketone monitors aren't available on the market yet. I did use a keto air device which tests the level of ketones that your body and muscles are using through acetate in the breath. And
Mhm.
so, and that, but I could only do that every hour because it was a breath device. So I did do it every single one of those intervals. So I didn't manage to see any of the variance before and afterwards. But my understanding of how the body works with ketones is generally, once they're churned and generated, we're a lot less sensitive to ketones than we are glucose per se. So I started off um, early on in the swim at around 6, ppm, which is a pretty, I would say, moderate level. By the time I hit halfway on this chart here, I was up to 33 ppm, and it kept pretty stable at 33 then for the rest of the swim. So I think I took about 8 or 9 measurements in total. And so you see the ketone levels effectively, ramp up. And then when effectively I hit around 12 o'clock on this chart here, then they just stayed stable at 33 ppm, which is a pretty, high level of ketosis. I did then test with a Keto Mojo device, before and afterwards. So it was about 20 minutes after the swim. I still hadn't eaten anything. I tested, and my glucose was in the range here. It was at 46, and my ketones were up at 5.2 millimoles per liter. And that was, yeah, about 20 minutes after the end of the swim.
Crazy. Fascinating. I think I'll show this. I was working on this blog to explain like how little glucose, what it causes. So 1 tablespoon of sucrose, 1 teaspoon of table sugar is 4 grams of carbohydrates. To honey is 1 teaspoon honey is 5.8 grams, and a
Yep.
banana is 1/10 slice of banana, and then white bread, a small bite, 4 grams. So it's interesting to look at what people say because I was diving into this blog. I'll do a video this week do you need glucose, and the low carb availability is what Stacy Sims was talking about. So I was like, okay, wait, these recommendations for the carbohydrates were kind of high math. I was doing the math for it, and it was just crazy that you need that many carbohydrates. I'm not saying I'm anti-carb. I know for performance wise, we need a certain amount. But if you do the math of the Society of Sports Nutrition, 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight within the first 30 minutes post workout. But also, they're talking about for pre workout for women before we tap into fat. So I'll do a video on that this week. But that's what led me down this rabbit hole. It's like, wait a minute, how does that actually work? And I talked to Dr. Mickey about her theory and her personal research in this space. But just to go over what you're saying, just the average glucose doesn't take much, but how your body is creating it from fat, or you can do it from protein. And that's why there's no essential carbohydrates. There's essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, and then we
Yep.
have ketones that a body can use in the brain. But just that science of just, I thought that was just so interesting of just the how much is equal to little tiny, all you need. And who eats just
Yeah.
one sip of orange juice or an apple of standard American food plan?
Yeah, so I wholeheartedly agree with all of that, and for me, it all starts to make sense when you look at it through an evolutionary perspective. So our biology is so complicated; it hasn't really changed from a systems perspective in the last 50,000 years. So this predates the agricultural cultural revolution and all of the carbohydrates that have been introduced to our supply chain. So if you go back then, we simply didn't have the need to deal with more than a teaspoon of glucose because we were predominantly in a ketogenic state, utilizing, fat and ketones as our fuel source. And so that's how our bodies are designed. And we can, when we do get exposed to carbohydrates, our body then works very hard to effectively try and store those as much as it can as fat. Yes, it can use them as fuel, but to your point, there's just a chronic overconsumption of sugar and carbohydrates in today's society, and a lot of that is driving metabolic dysfunction. And there was one of the reasons why I did the swim, just to try and reset the narrative a little bit that you don't need sugar and carbohydrates to fuel athletic endeavor, can fuel athletic endeavor without. And the happy place that most people want to get to, as we discussed last time, is metabolic flexibility, where you can utilize both fat and carbohydrates as a fuel source. And you're very thoughtful about how you do that, because the more carbohydrates you put into your body, the more your body will rely on that, the less it will utilize fat as a fuel source. And actually, a lot of people who consume a high carbohydrate diet simply can't utilize fat as a fuel source because the body has forgotten how to activate that kind of metabolic machinery.
Yeah, it goes both ways too, though, they say, right? If you don't have any carbohydrates, people get metabolically inflexible as well, that they're not able to metabolize carbohydrates. So having them in and around your workouts when you are more higher intensities that you're burning more glycogen, that could be beneficial for performance boost, but they're not necessary, right? But that's why some
So
people
that
do that carb timing.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's one of the things I'm interested to try and potentially test next, is this notion of, because I know, Tim Noakes, Jeff Volek, kind of a bunch of the, interesting scientists at the forefront of a lot of the low carb scene. A lot of the latest research shows that if you are fat adapted, you can oxidize fat at very high rates, which even to the high end of peak performance can provide the energy you need to sustain yourself, and do so in kind of in a it's a cleaner burning fuel. There's less less lactate, less reactive oxygen species, less, let's say, kind of damage that comes along with burning fat. So I'm interested to do that. At the same time, I currently believe that adding some carbohydrates in tactically or periodically, I think is a good thing. Just make sure they're small amounts. Just make sure they're whole food, natural carbohydrates, and it's not anything processed, because our bodies are used to dealing with that. And I think if you do that, then you're continually testing, and you're back to metabolic flexibility. Your body is continually having to utilize these different substrates, but do so my advice would be, do so from a low carb base, and then titrate your carbohydrates up, rather than being, at a high kind of carbohydrate base. Because if you're consistently at a high carbohydrate base, it's very difficult for your body to burn fat as fuel. I don't know, we were discussing before we went on air, a lot of the exogenous ketone supplements that kind of offer that, hey, take exogenous ketones, you can then utilize ketones and carbs as a fuel source. And whilst that might be true, it's still not your body really, you're just utilizing then an exogenous supplement. You're not really burning any of your own fat through kind of that metabolic machinery. So I personally advocate for going from a low carb base and then fueling for the work required if you have performance objectives, or if you have really intense workouts, or to make sure that you don't pay too much of a deficit to your hormone imbalance, because that is an interesting part of the equation. Back to, I would say, fasting and low carb, especially for females, be given the difference between in bodies. I know there's a lot of amazing work being, Dr. Mindy Peltz has been doing some amazing work the last kind of 5-10 years around this. So you do have to pay attention to those, but if you do so, you will be much more metabolically healthy and active, and that will translate into all aspects of life and longevity.
Yeah, there's a lot in all that. So it's metabolic flexibility, not being inflexible for having poor metabolism of either fuel source, but also men versus women in the fasting and not eating enough, and the LEA's low energy availability, and making sure we get enough calories in. And I got set off into a rabbit hole. The other day I heard Dr. Stacy talking about it's low energy availability, but it's really low carb availability. I was like, wait, how does that work? I don't understand. I'm open, I'm not arguing it, but I want to see research, understand mechanism of action. And that's what led me down to we just need 1 teaspoon of glucose in our bloodstream. Why do we need 50 grams of carbohydrates before a workout, before I go into fat metabolism? So I was trying to challenge that and get some evidence. Go, okay, am I wrong or do I need to be open to that? And then also for men versus women, how we metabolize fat differently than women do. And the stress hormones, kisspeptin, and is the main one people talk about that if we're not getting enough fuel on board. But is it really just low, not enough calories? Can I just have some good, easy to digest fat and that will help me? Or do I really need to have 40 grams? So that's what I'm doing, a bunch of rabbit hole podcasts coming up, but
Well,
that's
I
the
appreciate you,
confusing part.
yeah, going down the rabbit hole because this has similarly been on my mind from the research that I did. I think it's less important once you are when you're in exercise. I think it might be a little bit more important post exercise, and that's where the body can and will create the glucose that it needs. I think the question is, doing so can come with a little bit of a counter side that can, I think, impact the stress hormones and put a little bit too much stress on the body. So the body can do it, a bit like too much carbohydrates. The body can do it, but it puts too much stress on the body. So adding in very, small and tactical amounts of carbohydrate, I think post workout effectively takes the stress off the body of having to create, that itself, and therefore you're in more of homeostasis, adaptive stress, and you don't risk triggering going into the chronic stress. But I do think once you're active and exercising, certainly from my perspective, unless you are doing a super hard, tempo run or big long run at, if you're an elite athlete level, then I think from that perspective, then similarly, maybe the body does need a little bit more glucose, so helping taking the edge off that. But I still believe the majority of it can be, burned through fat without putting too much stress on the body. So my instinct, but I look forward to the outcome of your rabbit hole because I think it is super interesting, and that's where the technology is there these days to help people understand this themselves. So, continuous glucose monitors are now available over the counter, which is amazing news. The simple devices you can get to test and just going on feeling of trying things that work for you, but starting off, I think, with kind of a minimal low base and then building on top of that and really feeling, what works for you. And especially for women, I think where you're at in your cycle is also an important where sometimes you do need a little bit more carbohydrates, sometimes you need less. There are times to do fasted workouts, there are times not to. So I think much of it is let's all be citizen scientists and yeah, just figure out what works best for you and your own body. But neither one of the extremes for long periods of time is really ideal. I think it is back to that
Mhm.
flexibility from a low carb base and building up what works for you rather than the other way around. I think will get people to happiness, health, and longevity and athletic performance that they want and need.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's good to measure. So you can't manage it, something that you don't measure. So measuring, but using something as I use with clients, training peaks, or people use Tridot to track that data. And for females, tracking your cycle. And there's a free app that I use, FLO, and you can track your
Mm,
cycle that way. But I think it's super fascinating to look at your workout and timing your fueling and training for the female athlete that has hormone cycle. But it is like this weekend, this side note, but I felt amazing on my bike and felt strong and just could go and keep my heart rate down. And it was because it was middle of my cycle, TMI, but let's talk about it. But it's how
yeah.
if your workout performance improves when your hormones are the highest for females, and that's kind of before ovulation. So if you can track the cycle and just what Dr. Mindy Pelz has done, and I created a mapping your cycle and put it into training peaks for my female athletes, and it's super
Mm,
cool. But then you can figure out your fueling for that. So
yeah.
that was interesting. With you, though, going back to your event, did you feel that you needed to gain some weight beforehand? I know swimmers say, I was talking about what you're doing to my open water swimmers that do these long distance La Jolla swims, and Like, oh no, that's horrible to do. You don't, should be doing that. You need to be gain weight, get fatter, so you have more buoyancy and fat fuel on board. Did you try to gain weight before you started the event?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say I didn't try, but I did. Actually, I think for me, a lot of this was back to hormones, actually more male hormones specifically.
Mm,
So the backstory to this is at the start of this year, as I transitioned from my 20 years in tech into health and wellness and my new mission to help 1 billion plus people become metabolically healthy, I was running this kind of amazing kind of mental high in this kind of new possibility that for a few days I was waking up at 1 o'clock in the morning and not able to get back to sleep. So I would then get up and I would be, reading and just being productive. And, I was just absorbing all the amazing information in this kind of new world of metabolic health. Now I'm very conscious and aware of how important sleep is. And I figured after a few days, my body would say this is not sustainable and it would sleep longer. But that sleep of 3 to 4 hours a night lasted for 2.5 months instead of the few days that I thought it would. And naive me at the time was also training for the Boston Marathon and doing all these other things. And I still had a lot of it. I was still executing my runs amazingly well. But yeah, I long runs were starting to become a struggle, and that's when I was adding more fuel and that wasn't making any difference. And eventually I kind of realized, no, look, there's something not quite right here. I got my bloods test and my testosterone levels were like 101. My free testosterone was way down, I think, 11. It was pretty horrific. So building back up from the base of that, one of the things, and I was doing this naturally, is the body is just is hungry for all and any types of food. So I would say through the period of the few months that I was trying to rebalance and doing the swim training, I probably put on, I would say, 20 kilos on top of my running weight, which is quite a lot. I was going to the gym a lot more, so I was building a lot more muscle. So yes, I did put on, I would say, it's quite a significant amount of weight, but that wasn't, I would say, purposefully done. It was back to what my body, I think, felt it needed to be back
mhm.
in a more level of homeostasis. But once I put that on, I did stay relatively kind of constant. So yeah, I did have obviously a lot more fat stores, going into the swim, which I do think was helpful, but it wasn't purposeful. And yeah, I would say, the 2, 3 weeks leading up to the swim, I actually purposely tried to keep things just as, and I kind of eat, I would say, intuitively anyway. So I was on, very low carb, high healthy fat, moderate protein, what kind of works for me. And yeah, I just ate that pretty much until well, absolutely until the day before, because what I didn't, a lot of people were asking, well, are you gonna, eat huge amounts the day before? Are you gonna load up on carbohydrates? And for me, that would defeat the point of doing the swim, because then there's this concept of, okay, well, you're fat adapted, you've just eaten 2,000 calories of carbs the day before. I really wanted the body to get to that level of gluconeogenesis and just prove that in that state, the body will happily continue to allow you to do moderate intensity exercise and feel great and kind of continue. And that's exactly what I did and exactly what happened on Swim Challenge Day.
Hmm. All right, so I was just going to go back to your website just to share, and let's talk about what you did fueling wise. So September 19th, 22 miles, totally fasted, water electrolytes burning 9,632 calories. So David didn't swim fasted. He changed his plan.
Yeah, so the initial plan was for both myself and my brother to do it totally fasted. Dave's training didn't go to plan. He's got 2 young kids, and I think he just struggled to get the training volume in and the nutritional change to switch. I've done a lot more fat adapted things I would say in the past, so I had probably a better kind of baseline there. And it was kind of his dream swim in his head for the last 5 years, ever since he discovered open water swimming. So we always agreed
Mm,
that for him, completing the swim was the most important.
yeah.
But no, so yeah, but I yeah, stopped every hour just to take on water and electrolytes. And that was it. I didn't eat anything for breakfast. My last meal was, I think, about 5 p.m. I ate pretty early the day before. And I had a nice, yeah, ribeye steak. with and then I had kind of a bit of a keto brick kind of coconut yogurt type dessert with some RX sugar snacks and some macadamia nuts. And the only carbohydrates I probably, yeah, I had a little bit of maybe 6 spears of asparagus. Maybe had a little bit of avocado, which there's a very small amount of carbohydrate in, but I kept, yeah, super low the day prior. And so I ended up doing probably 27 hours fasted. Of those, yeah, 12 hours swimming, nine. And that was a really cool thing, actually. I did think I would burn probably around 10,000 calories. So to finish the swim and, have a look at my watch and see I'd burned 9,632 calories, feeling, pretty largely great. And just knowing that I'd consumed zero and I'd just taken on water electrolytes, that, yeah, it felt pretty magical.
Did you get sponsored by these guys, Keto Brick? You get Robert Savage to give you some
So
bricks?
yeah, so I would say not sponsored per se, but yeah, but Robert very kindly
That's
sent
good
me through,
advertisement.
sent me through a bunch of bricks, similarly with RX Sugar and similarly House of Macadamia, because they were largely, yeah, my training fuel really
Yeah.
was a mixture of those three macadamia nuts, keto bricks, and RX Sugar products. So it was actually nice to do the training and still eat great, delicious, nutritious food, just fueling the fat side of the body. And yeah, we had amazing conditions on the day. As I mentioned at the start, we were prepared for it to be, torrential downpour, huge kind of
Mm.
which there can be in Scotland. And thankfully, the weather gods were really incredibly kind to us. So we had a beautiful day.
So you didn't do any essential amino acids or anything else, but just electrolytes?
Yep, correct. So on the day, no essential amino acids or anything. It purely was just water and electrolytes. The During training, I think I mentioned on a previous podcast, I do and still use Perfect Amino kind of, regularly,
Yes.
purely just from a want to make sure I get enough quality protein that is, absorbable. And I did quite often, sometimes I would take those on fasted workouts, sometimes not. Back to our conversation earlier, I still think a lot of the science needs to be looked into is if you are fat adapted, are you really, kind of utilize, burning, is your body breaking down muscle to fuel gluconeogenesis or other things, or is it utilizing, fat? And I think there's maybe still some question marks there. So I did more as a protective measure. But on the day, no, it was just water electrolytes. The only thing I should mention out of true transparency is the only additional thing that I had was first thing in the morning, because we woke up at 4 a.m. We had to leave at 5:15. So I did have just a black coffee, first thing in the morning to try and make sure that I, let's say, was swimming as comfortably as possible and didn't need to,
Yeah.
try and take the wet stuff off halfway
You
through.
didn't want to
But
have to go
obviously,
poop while you're swimming.
it would rather not, especially given how cold it was. So that was the only
Yeah.
other thing that I had. I had a black coffee very first thing in the morning just to get everything else, moving. But obviously that has zero calories in, and just to yeah to make the day a little bit more enjoyable.
So you didn't do any fuel beforehand that pre-race, prevent. So just when was the
No,
last time you ate before you started the swim?
so it was about 5:30 p.m. the previous evening.
Wow.
Um, so that was my last meal. And again, I specifically wanted to do that because even if I'd have had I actually tried during training. I tried both ways. I thought, well, let me try having something in the morning in terms of obviously it was a high fat content breakfast, but I actually found that I felt worse doing that. And once the body got into that rhythm of utilizing its own, I just felt a lot more comfortable. So from that perspective, and I thought it was also just better optically to do it that way, literally to wake up, to be fasted, and then go through a full 24-hour, period of fasting, 12 of
Hmm.
those, swimming. I really kind of wanted to do it that way. And that's the other interesting thing, I think, that and I would say I was a little bit more hungry throughout the swim in certain points than I thought I would be. But that was, I think, just because, so I flew to the UK about just 6 days ahead of the swim and just had horrific sleep the whole time. So I
Hmm.
flew overnight on a red eye, which is, so you don't sleep then, and then was kind of almost in different places almost every night. The night before the swim was I just had a terrible night's sleep. It was pretty warm in the place that we were staying. The day before the swim actually was quite warm, and so I just really was chronically underslept for kind of the week going into the swim. So I think because of that, there's a few times when I was a little bit more hungry than I expected to, but after 5 minutes, the body then remembers that it's got fuel. You forget about it and you just carry on. And even when I finished the swim, I wasn't particularly hungry. I did have some of the snacks from the companies that have been very kind of kind to help and sponsor to help raise awareness for kind of great training fuel snacks. But yeah, I wasn't also particularly hungry afterwards. Back to when the body is in that kind of metabolic state, it gets into kind of homeostasis, and you just feel like you can kind of keep going and keep going.
When you got done, when you were able to eat, what did you have as your post-race meal?
Yeah, good question. So my mum and dad came up to watch, which was really nice, and my older brother was there. So celebratory, Christmas, birthdays, smoked salmon and champagne is always kind of my mum and dad's go-to for what they did. So we had some smoked salmon and champagne to celebrate the swim, and then just had a really nice. Mum did a really nice home cooked meal. So I think we had a pork stew, with some vegetables. So that was yeah, it was nice to have kind of a home cooked meal. But back to being a whole food, still, largely yeah, kind of, keto based. Because yeah, that's also generally now these days the foods that I enjoy. I do most of the carbohydrates I consume are really above ground grown vegetables, and in still relatively small and modest amounts. So sometimes we'll cycle in a little bit more. I'll add, half a sweet potato, maybe every couple of weeks, or on intense training, after intense training sessions, just to add a little bit more of a stimulus in there, back to the metabolic flexibility. But yeah, that was but I did make sure to eat a decent amount post the swim, purely, even though I didn't feel I needed it, purely back to not wanting to pay too high a price on the hormone levels. Because I think then if I'd have continued, I would say, to fast and not eat, and beyond then I do think that could have paid a negative impact on the hormone side of things. So I am in a couple of weeks, actually, I should get my blood test results back. So Cyfox very kindly gave me some blood testing kits. So I did one the morning of the swim, one after the swim, and I did one a couple of weeks before. I did one just a couple of days ago to get kind of a before and afterwards. So I'm interested to see what the outcome of those kind of blood tests, and if there was any, significant changes in differences. But I did make sure to eat a good hearty meal afterwards to, yeah, not be to be a little bit kinder to the hormones.
Yeah, that's what I would think post workout when we're more, your muscles are going to uptake all that glycogen if you ate some type of glucose, carbohydrate, and protein to help refuel and repair.
Yeah, so it was back to one of the things that was on my mind, because that's what the a lot of the common kind of literature states. But I do think if you are highly fat adapted, and therefore your muscles are actually, they adapt to utilize fat and ketones as a fuel source. Then I think the question is, well, how much carbohydrates do you need to, I would say, refuel? And that's where it gets interesting.
I
And I think it's
know.
back to the, small amounts. I think for me to take the pressure off, I would say the kind of gluconeogenesis. But my own personal view, and this is not based off any research paper in science, it's purely down to my own self, is that even that amount is a lot less than people think, and I would say believe it is. Because then you
Mhm.
start getting, I think, on more of a slippery slope. The more carbohydrates you end up consuming, the more glycogen you have in your muscles, the more your body will always utilize that first before going to fat burning. Because back to the 1 teaspoon of blood in our blood sugar is it's toxic to our bodies to have too much carbohydrates and blood sugar in circulation. So your body will always look to utilize that first. And a lot of people say, oh, it's, it's a more efficient fuel source, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's purely back to evolutionary biology and the fact that our bodies are, clearing it. So if we do get more glucose, then, the muscles are the biggest sink for that glucose to go to. But I do think if you are fat adapted, I do think that you need a lot less carbohydrates. And for me, it's just to take the edge off so the body's not having to work harder than it needs to create that small amount of glucose needed. And that was the other hopefully amazing thing by the swim, demonstrating actually, yeah, your body only needs, and it down regulates glucose when you're stopped to only the minimal amount that it needs. So you will always, your body will always be able to do that.
That's so fascinating because it's similar to what I've been struggling with these recommendations, especially for female athletes pre-workout. And like, don't I just need like 5 grams of carbs if I'm doing a more of an intense workout, or maybe I'm trying to burn fat, but they're saying you need to have so many carbs as a female versus a male to burn fat. It's like, wait, why, if that's true, why do I need so much? I don't need 20 grams or more if I could do just a little coconut sugar in my layered superfood milk creamer that I put in my coffee. I mean, that's what I just think. It's like, that doesn't make sense. If you are more efficient at using fat as a main fuel source than others, and what you're saying is the more carbs you eat, the more possibly you could be dependent on using that fuel source first. And that's why I'd love to test all this with my Pinoy metabolism testing and really go for an individual. Okay, let's do an experiment. Let's test and see what fuel source you're using, because we can see all that while you're exercising with the oxygen and carbon dioxide face mask gas analyzed. So it'd be kind of cool
Yeah.
to I wanted someone to come do that. It's like, let's do a test today and do one tomorrow and just find where your zone 2 is, where your peak fat burning is, your metabolic crossover point, and then practice, experiment with different fuel sources, fasted versus having a little carbs, a lot of carbs, just fat, and just do a whole experiment. Again, test and not guess, and you don't know what you don't know. So unless you get these type of testing done, you're just kind of guessing and assuming what you're metabolizing as your main fuel source.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that actually. And I think one of the other interesting things, because I've worn CGMs before, mostly to look at my, response to different foods and meals as most people do. But actually, what the other fascinating learning I've had through doing this is I think, especially if you're on relatively low carb, I think your glucose level is also can give you a good proxy into, the stress impact of the body. So one of the other interesting things that I noticed that week that I was in the UK, obviously the time, difference, the jet lag, the lack of sleep, normally my average glucose would be around kind of 80 to 85. It was up really 100 that week before the swim.
Mm.
And even though I was eating exactly the same thing, and I think that was the lack of sleep and the additional stress on the body. So even in that perspective, you upregulate your glucose production because the body is more in a stress mode. It's less in a relaxed mode. And for me, I think a lot of that, and it wasn't particularly down to I wasn't feeling stressed about the event per se. I think it really was down to the lack of sleep. And so
Mhm.
I do think that looking at, I think average glucose kind of values also give you an insight and proxy into the stress of the body, and I think is a good proxy to, I would say, a lot of the hormones and what's going on behind the scenes. But I agree with you. If you don't test, then I think you've got less of a baseline to work with, and I think a balance between testing and intuitively then
Yes.
sensing kind of the different signals your body tells you, but a lot of that comes over time and with experience.
Well, that's why I think testing, and then you know what it feels like, paying attention to when you're matching your fueling and training differently. And then you know to avoid those red flags, or when you need to feel because you know your own body, and then start
Yeah,
applying that intuition after we've done these experiments and go, okay, this is when I nailed it. This is what it feels like when I don't have enough on board, but what do I need on board? And figure that out. And how many things impact that metabolism, as you said, stress, lack of sleep, jet lag, you know, other things that are going to disrupt your hormones and cause that metabolic chaos that will disrupt your fat metabolism.
yeah. So it's one of the things I was just came to mind actually. I don't know if you've ever interviewed, yeah, Dr. Jeff Volek or Dr. Steve Finney. Obviously, both of them have been kind of
Yeah,
legends from a science perspective. So it would be cool to, yeah, maybe if not, yeah, see if we
I
could get them
tried.
interested to do a deeper dive discussion exactly, around this. I'm happy to give my perspective, from the swim, but I do think it's a really important point, how much helps takes the edge off and gives you less risk of triggering into the chronic stress versus adaptive stress, I think is a really important um, question that, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of research going into this at the moment, but I'm sure that they will be on the forefront of that.
Well, I start Peter Defty and I are going to do a follow-up podcast. I just was messaging him yesterday, and then I'll try to get to Volek. And then I need Sammy because I texted him or LinkedIn him and he didn't respond, but I'll work on getting him on too because of his experience in those ultra swimming he did or kayak. What do you do? Not
So
kayak. What do you
he
do?
Well, so he did the Fat Chance row. So
Yeah, rowing. That's what it
yeah,
was.
he rowed across, I think it was across the Atlantic.
Yeah,
Him and
to
his
Hawaii,
wife,
I thought.
and
Is
did
it?
so 100% on a ketogenic diet so it was called Fat Chance row to demonstrate similarly to what I did that the body can do amazing things without carbohydrates. And so
Hmm.
very different, yeah, well, I would say different type of challenge, obviously a lot longer, a lot more, sustained. But yeah, I was amazed when I came across that and saw that he and his wife had done that. So it was also testing, I would say, yeah, he had a fun intro on the website. So obviously it was a kind of a metabolic demonstration, but also I think it was, to test how the marriage copes with, the two of you just being stuck in a boat for, for
Yeah, that'd be a big part.
I think however long it take them. But
It's
no, they
funny.
managed to complete it successfully and broke records along the way as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your recap today. And then I'll put the links in the show notes so people can read your blog and follow all the data. And when you upload the blood test, hormone testing before and after, that'll be fascinating. We'll add that into the show notes when we put it on the podcast and then make sure people watch the YouTube video so they can see your videos and links to that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to try and work on a little mini documentary to bring some of this together. But as I get the results back, I'll do some updates and posts to share because I think it is interesting to understand, yeah, what was going on underneath the scenes, and then yeah, people can follow along, and then I just need to dream up what my next challenge is going to be. But I promised my wife and the family that I would, yeah, have a few months back to normalcy before anything else crazy.
Yeah, maybe something next year or 2 years.
That's probably, yeah, maybe I did think ahead of this, like doing a challenge every year. So yeah, maybe towards the end of next year. But and this is one of the other things just to mention. I am still working to get my, I would say, hormones back into balance because it has been one of the big realizations of doing this swim. It has been a little bit of a compromise to balance the amount of training needed to be able to execute the swim. So I did promise myself once the swim's done, then make sure I get my hormones truly back into balance
Yeah.
because the other big learning is, you know, hormones are just the foundation of everything. So if you're not building on a stable hormonal platform, then whatever you build is not going to be as solid and certain as you do off a better hormonal base. So going to work hard to make sure I get myself fully back into balance.
And that is what my purpose is to help educate people how to prevent doing that to themselves and never race again, like myself. So that is my book, Life is Not a Race, It is a Journey, and how you have to pay attention to those red flags so you don't dig yourself deeper and deeper into that hole that you can't get out of very easily.
I 1000% agree. And that was honestly, yeah, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned and it was just naivety. I knew that I couldn't figure out where this energy source still was coming from. And I think my body obviously was just running on cortisol the whole time. But yeah. And so anyway, naive
Yeah.
me, that was definitely a big lesson learned. But actually, the last thing I would leave is it is so important because when those hormones are not balanced, you're fighting against your own body, not only the physical activity that you're doing, but it has started to show a little bit sometimes on, I would say on the mental health side as well, because then when everything's kind of not working properly, even, I've had struggles over the last 3 to 6 months, sometimes when, yeah, when you're traveling or you're, sleep deprived or some of those sorts of things. So I wholeheartedly agree. It is truly, truly important to try and catch those red flags early on and not let it get to a chronic state because it is much more, you can reverse it. It's just,
Long.
it's challenging and it takes a lot longer.
Well,
Absolutely.
stress is on, everything else is off pretty much. So we call that as FDN practitioners metabolic chaos. And you get that whole dismantle of being catabolic breakdown state. Parasites come up because you don't have your first line of defense and the whole domino effect. So, yeah, don't go there. All
Crucially
right.
important.
Thank you so much. We'll put all the links in the show notes and we can answer any questions people have. Just put them in the link below. And then if we need to do another follow up on the hormone blood test, and even if you can do a GI test, see if you have any pathogens from swimming in that water, though it's
Well,
pretty clean.
so actually, well, so I did. So Genova Diagnostics very kindly gave me a
Good.
microbiome test to do. So I did a before and after microbiome as well. So
Yay. Let's dive
yes.
into that.
So yeah, I managed to get everything. Only one thing I would have loved to do, yeah, a DEXA scan to look at the kind of impact in really in
Hmm.
muscle loss.
That would be good.
So maybe that's just something I'll need to check off next time.
To make sure you write your post race report, event report, so you know what you do differently next time and what you'd add in.
Yes, very wise words, 100%.
Did you do that? I have all my clients do that. So make sure you, because then you remember, oh, next time I'll do this test, this how I'll do pre and post and anything else. So when you're doing
So I have
experiments,
not
you can do,
yet, but it's a very good. My coach, yeah, we always used to do the same thing after events. So yes, I will
all
do
right,
that now, and then I'll add more to it as the results come back from the tests. That is
okay,
a
I'll
good
hold you
reminder.
accountable.
Thank you, Coach Debbie.
All right. Thanks so much for your time. Great job.